This is Angela Arden. Welcome to my 12th episode of Hollywood Stars, Stories, Articles, and More. On a cold autumn day, I made myself a cup of warm tea and was sitting down. I was looking for something to read, and I came across this periodical called Energy Times. Did I say it was 2016? It was 2013. The periodical is November, December of 2013. And on the cover is a lovely picture of actor, movie star, hilarious comedian Jim Carrey. That portion of the cover that refers to him says, "How Jim Carrey rolls spiritually and as a children's book author pondering identity." So, in addition to his accolades, we can add children's book author. Now, initially, I had mixed feelings about doing this particular episode with Jim Carrey. So first, let me tell you the reasons why I wanted to do it. This story that Jim Carrey tells has such an amazing spiritual, it's going to blow your mind. Your mind is just, you know that emoji where it shows the little guy and his brain just is exploding? That's what you're going to feel like when you hear this story. And also for all the reasons I just read. I've seen every one of his movies. Well, at least a lot of them. I've seen Liar, Liar, Bruce Almighty, Pet Detective, of course. Alrighty then, has become a mainstay in my vocabulary. The Cable Guy, and then most recently, The Sunshine of the Spotless Mind with Jennifer Aniston, in which she was amazing. She was also in Bruce Almighty, and she was also very good in that too. And then The Truman Show, which to me was his opus. If you have never seen The Truman Show, I would start there. I would start with that if I were you. It's just phenomenal. Also, when I have seen him on any late show, like even Jay Leno back in the day, to, the Steve Colbert Show, the James Corden Show, Late with James Corden. When he was on Dave, when he's been on Conan, just all of them, really. Now, here's why I'm mentioning this, because what I'm saying about this is when he was on these shows, the only guest that I would say was funnier than him was the late, great Robin Williams. And then, of course, you have to add also Jonathan Winters. Then Jim Carrey, man. And I would say followed only by like Steve Martin and Marty Short. And really Marty Short for his entrances. They're usually, one-of-a-kind musical, theatrical sensations. But just for thinking off the top of his head, brilliance, you have got to give it to Robin and Jim Carrey, man. So it is clear that I like the fellow. And now here's the reasons why I didn't. Why I wasn't torn at first, but then something happened the following year that made me leery. And I'm going to tell you what it was right now. In 2014, John Mayer, whom the preceding episode here is where Don is interviewing John Mayer. Don was the producer of Saw Brock, which is John Mayer's new LP or CD or cassette or whatever, download, whatever your particular preferences for receiving your music called Sob Rock. And in Sob Zine, which I was really, really fortunate to receive, Don Was interviews John Mayer. So that's my previous episode. And so this following story, you will realize why it made me leery to put this story afterwards. But then there's something after that that made it, to my mind, okay again. In 2014, a year after Jim Carrey told this story to Energy Times, John Mayer was going to be a host filler for 3 days between on the Late Late show, which was being hosted by Craig Ferguson. And Craig Ferguson was departing, and there was a 3-day span between when Craig Ferguson was departing and when the new host, James Corden, would be arriving. And so John Mayer said that he would take those 3 days. And that was February 4th, 5th, and 6th of 2015. And John Mayer said on Twitter, on February 4th, his guest would be Andy Cohen. On February 5th, Jim Carrey. And on February 6th, Ed Sheeran. And I watched each show live, or as close to live as you can get. Probably it was recorded 3 hours in advance, or something like that. Anywho, at the beginning of the show on February 5th, John Mayer came out. I believe he did his stand-up routine. You know, his stand-up routine at the beginning of a show like Jimmy Fallon does, or anybody else, or back in the day, Johnny Carson, remember that name? Johnny Carson, my mom used to watch that show, and he was, wow. I mean, I'm going off point, but it's worth it because Johnny Carson was a master of the late night program, and if you haven't seen that late night show, if you haven't seen that, YouTube Johnny Carson, man. YouTube him. And know who that person is and what they brought to planet Earth. So John Mayer finishes his opening monologue, is what it is called, and then he says his guest that evening will be Jim Carrey. Now this is a big mystery in Hollywood land, because it was never, and you can go on chat rooms and it's still, everybody's like, no one knows, what happened. I sure would like to know what happened. Gee, I sure would have liked to have seen that interview. And nobody knows what happened. So because I didn't know, and John Mayer never, I guess, felt comfortable to say, or for whatever reason did not say, I always thought, I don't really feel comfortable. I don't know if I feel comfortable. Then I didn't, like I said, I had this interview well before I even started Hollywood Stars, Stories, Articles, and More. But after that happened, I just didn't feel comfortable once I started this, adding it. I really wanted to, but I didn't because of that. I was really torn. And then, like a sunrise, like a rainbow, John Mayer did an interview with Kerwin Frost, which was really recent. In fact, I'm going to go to the internet. I'll be right back, and I'm going to get the date of that Kerwin Frost interview for you so you can check that out. Hang on, I'll be right back. I'm back. It's magic, I tell you. Okay, the Kerwin Frost interview, where he interviews John Mayer, was March 12th of this year, 2021. This also is this comes highly recommended if you get the chance. My beautiful YouTube, that's where it is. And, YouTube. And just type in Kerwin Frost interviews John Mayer. You can put March 12th on there if you want, 2021. And it's a really, really good interview. It's very in-depth. Kerwin Frost is, he is an up-and-comer in the interview world, and it just comes to him naturally. He's just out there being him, and that's what makes it so great. He's not trying to be anybody that he's not. He's just being who he is. So he is interviewing John Mayer. He asks him a lot of very novel questions. For instance, he asks him what, if he can tell him in depth what it was to know Steve Jobs. He gets John to open up about how his mind operates when he is on stage. Basically, you know, he knows that certain people are there for certain songs, but he can't like read minds and tell who's there for what song. And he knows some people go away angry at the end of the night because he didn't play that particular song that, you know, George Malin-Corange song, or say the last time I saw Tori, which, by the way, if you haven't heard that song, that's another one too. I'm just giving recommendations. It's like every time I give a recommendation, you guys should make this like a drink game and like listen to this whole thing from start to end. And every time I make a recommendation, drink a shot of tequila. Although I don't drink these days, I think that would be something to do. If you're in college, do that. So, here comes a recommendation. Feel free to drink. And the recommendation is, gosh, what does that go with? There's a song called, I believe it's called The Last Time I Saw Tori. And it is, I probably have the title a little bit wrong, but it is some of John Mayer's earlier stuff, and it's very sweet. It's very, you know, college life and friendship, like, you know, dynamics, you know. And I think my takeaway from that song, without giving anything away, is that there is a great deal of, there is a quality of respect between John and this girl named Tori, and really between the other person, which is her ex-boyfriend, that I don't know if anybody stops to think about when they listen to that song. But I heard it. I did. I heard the respect that John has for not just Tori, but especially Tori's ex-boyfriend, who clearly was probably a good friend of his. So check that out. And then while you're at it, check out, I would go to John Mayer Rare, and you're going to find a lot of songs that have never been recorded that he just, he performed at a place called Eddie's Attic in Georgia. And among them is a song called I Like to Eat an Orange with my friend George Malin-Corange by John Mayer. If you get a chance, check that out too. Drink, because that's also a recommendation. All right, so now getting to the part that is the sunshine moment for being able to, in my mind, to feel that I can now once again positively consider making this this story that Jim Carrey tells an actual episode, is this. John Mayer says to Kerwin Frost, "Have you ever seen the movie The Truman Show?" And right then, Angel sang, because he then went on to talk about the movie and how it affected him. It is an amazing movie. You know, as I said at the beginning of this, definitely, if you haven't seen that, check that out. That's also a recommendation, and you know what to do. So, so since he mentioned, you see, a Jim Carrey movie, I thought, okay, This is a closed chapter, and I believe that it is. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I now bring you the said, spoken of, Jim Carrey story. Enjoy. How Jim Carrey rolls, spiritually and as a children's book author, pondering identity. This is from November-December 2013, Energy Times. And their tagline is, under their title of their periodical, Enhancing Your Vitality, Body and Nutrition, Health and Harmony. How Jim Carrey rolls, spiritually and as the author of a new children's book that ponders identity and existential questions. By Alan Richer. During a recent break from filming the sequel to the 1994 comedy Dumb and Dumber in Atlanta, Jim Carrey leaned back in his seat in the Georgia Dome and relished the showdown between the Atlanta Falcons and New England Patriots. Carrey didn't care one way or the other that the Patriots won, or who had even played for that matter. He reveled in the scene like a sun worshiper at the beach. Quote, "A lot of people watch football to see the game and to get into the thrill of competition," Carrey said. "I love football, but I don't have this burning competitive edge to me that is going to die if one of the teams doesn't do well. I'm a weird fan, a spiritual fan. I like everybody to have a fantastic game, and mostly I like to be at the stadium. It's a feeling of oneness, a feeling of being with people and being connected to them. I kind of sit there and expand my consciousness and take the whole stadium in and feel all that energy. It's really a blast." End quote. That holistic view means you won't find Carrey in a fantasy league or tallying player statistics. Quote, "I don't do any of that stuff, so I'm kind of useless in the broadcast booth." End quote. Carrey chuckles. Quote, "I look at it on a different level. I look at sports as presence. I really do. When guys are at the peak of their abilities and they're running after a ball and trying to do the best they can to accomplish a task, and they're completely confused on it, you can't help but be focused on them, and therefore you're free from the past and the future." End quote. Fans of Carrey's zany and sometimes naive, often sanguine characters, and even of his more dramatic roles, Truman Burbank of The Truman Show, for instance, about a hapless insurance salesman who discovers his life has been one long TV reality show, might have a hard time squaring the introverted comic with introspective terms like oneness and presence. Yet here is the man who played the goofball pet detective Ace Ventura by speaking from his posterior like it was a ventriloquist's dummy, now talking of expanded consciousness and spirituality. If Carrey's fans haven't recognized these deeper concepts in his work thus far, they will now. The two-time Golden Globe-winning comic actor has added children's book author to his resume with the September release of How Roland Rolls, parenthesis, Some Kind of Garden, and parenthesis, comma, about a wave named Roland who worries what will happen to him when he hits a beach. Roland wrestles with fear about his mortality, but finds a far more profound existence in the realization that all things are connected and boundless. The story, which Carrey dedicated to his grandson Jackson, reflects Carrey's own childhood fears of loss. Subtitle: A Mystic's Life. For Carrey, 51, the book and the lessons it conveys, gleaned from what he says are a lifetime of mystical experiences, signal a spiritual coming out of sorts. Quote, "It's one of the simpler things I've done," comma, end quote. Carrey says, quote, "And yet, it's really an important moment because it's the purest spiritual message I've put out there as far as how I feel about things. From the time I was a very young kid, I've had wonders and miracles in my life. I've had a very mystical life, and I haven't really talked too much about this with anybody, period," end quote. Carrey's spiritual bent is most famously evident in the $10 million check the then struggling comic wrote himself, quote, "for acting services rendered," comma, end quote, post-dating it to Thanksgiving 1995. By then, Carrey had become a superstar on the success of Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. The story is part of modern Hollywood lore. After his father died, Carrey slipped the check into Percy Carey's pocket. "It was his dream too," Carrey reflects. "He was always supportive of me. He drove people crazy. He was so thrilled about my talent," end quote. Carrey says he gives a shout out to his father in each film performance by integrating the older man's mannerisms or traits. His father is evident in Carrey's earnest and optimistic Truman character. And here is my first aside, which is to tell you that story in a little bit more detail. Jim Carrey grew up homeless, basically. He and his family lived out of the family car. And I believe they lived in Hollywood. And his dad would go to work every day, like a regular job. I'm not sure about if it was in Hollywood. I get that impression in my mind from remembering this story. I could be wrong about that, but I think so. And his dad would come home after a long day at work, and they would usually sit on someone's lawn or something like that, and and Jim was the one who felt it was up, that he could lift people out of their sadness and their depression and pretty much the moment of being homeless by making them laugh. And he did this mainly through impressions. Take a look at Jim Carrey's drink, because I'm giving you another recommendation to take a look at Jim Carrey's earliest works. You could go to Living Color if you want. Go to Yahoo or go to Google, type in Living Color Jim Carrey or Jim Carrey Living Color, and you will find some of the finest impressions of James Dean and Clint Eastwood, and that's just a couple off the top of my head. He did everybody, and to such a degree that you forgot you were looking at Jim Carrey, or you couldn't understand how this person could contort his face and his voice in such a way that he wasn't Jim Carrey anymore. He was not Jim Carrey anymore. He was the guy that he was impersonating. And it was phenomenal in the true sense of the word. So he would be doing these impressions mainly, and just being funny, trying out new stuff, and cracking his family up until they went to, until finally everybody just said, okay, it's time to go to sleep or what have you. And, they were hungry, and they didn't have warmth, and they didn't have a lot of comfort, but they had laughter. So perhaps that helps you understand why, not just how, but why he crafted his craft. So early on in his career, he wanted to make a success of himself, and he apparently believed in manifestation and visualization better than anybody who's ever wrote about it, because he did it without writing about it, without professing it to everyone, and he just did it by way of writing a check to himself one day. I believe he was looking at the Hollywood sign, and he had decided he wanted to be successful as an actor and a comedian in Hollywood. And he had an extra check. I think it was from probably a bank account that had closed, that he probably had to close because he couldn't keep enough money in it to keep it open. So what does Jim do? He writes a check for a certain amount of money, $10 million, paid to Jim Carrey, and then he wrote for acting services rendered. For acting services rendered. How positive of him. He was sending his future this positive light, this wish of success. He was sending a beam of light to his future. And do you know what? The reason he was able to take that check out of his wallet and put it in his dad's pocket, his dad, Mr. Percy Carey, on the day of his funeral, Mr. Percy Carey's funeral, is because he had made good on that check. That check had come to fruition, that $10 million, through the success of Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. And on that day, he had received the last of those 3 small fortunes for those movies, and it was over $10 million. Now you know the story, the famous story of Jim Carrey's check. In those early years on the comedy circuit, after finishing performances at 2 or 3 clubs a night, Carrey would sit in the hills above Los Angeles and look over the city. Which, if you have never been up to the Hollywood sign, drink. This is a recommendation. I suggest that, if you're ever in Los Angeles, head on up to Hollywood and wait until evening. You're not, they kind of like, the residents all pretend to frown upon the tourists hiking up to the Hollywood sign. But guess what? The roads belong to the government and therefore to the people. And so does that space up where the Hollywood sign is. Come on. There's so many tourists going past our fabulous Mulholland homes, that's their gripe. Sorry, not buying it, but that's just on the down low between you and I. Really, if you want to know my opinion on that, they should it would behoove Hollywood to make a fortified, bona fide brick and mortar stairway from like Hollywood Park up to the Hollywood sign, because that is a lot, that would provide a lot of revenue to the city, because it's a national treasure, and it certainly is a treasure of Hollywood itself, to see the Hollywood sign. People want to go up and pose with it, especially these days with social media. They want to go up and take selfies next to the Hollywood sign, or take group pictures, group selfies, you know, where you hold the camera way up and there's a big group of you behind, and you, like that, with the Hollywood sign, man. So they're really looking at the empty half of that glass rather than the full. There's my 3.5 cents on that. And now back to the article. So in those early years on the comedy circuit, after finishing performances at 2 or 3 clubs a night, and another aside, you see, when I read these articles, they're sort of like conversations that I'm having with you, even though I can't, you know, it's kind of a one-sided conversation. I'm hoping that I'm able to stop and share tidbits of information and conversation that I would share with you if you were sitting right here with me and we were talking back and forth about the aspects of this article. So here I just wanted to, my aside is that I lived in Hollywood for a while. I lived on the, very near the corner of Gower and Sunset Boulevard. If you were to cross Sunset, take the sidewalk across to the other side of the street, you would be about one shop away from the Viper Room, which at one time was owned by River Phoenix and Johnny Depp, 2 other young bucks. Oh, I think definitely, I think Leo DiCaprio, and someone else whose name does not come to mind right now, but you can always Google that. Drink! You can Google that and check that out, who that 4th person was, after the horribly tragic death of very young, handsome, talented, charming, darling, and nice River Phoenix. I believe that they opted out of owning it. Nobody wanted to do it anymore because it was just such a very sad thing from then on, and they sold it very quickly after that into new hands. But I do believe that the Viper Room still is there. I'm not sure who owns it, who still is part of that, and who isn't. That would also probably be worth checking out. Drink! But the aside that I wanted to tell you is that when I did live there, gosh, for years and years, I had amazing friends. We did amazing stuff. I dabbled in acting pretty much so I could stay in the area and, you know, stargaze along with everybody else, with tourists and locals alike, you know, just to be part of that scene, to say I was part of Hollywood, which I can now say that I was. And I frequented clubs. You could walk to the clubs from where I lived. And I walked to many a night. I walked to the Comedy Store, the Improv, not to mention some of the best and most iconic nightclubs on planet Earth, and that would be the Troubadour, Whiskey A Go Go, the teeny but fabulous Rainbow Room. I mean, we're talking, you know, Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, the Rolling Stones, man, the Doors. Later on, Van Halen, the Ramones, our homeboy, John Mayer, the Beach Boys, who I briefly worked for when I worked for Management 3 under Jerry Weintraub, who originally, he was in Hollywood. He was the manager of Marilyn Monroe, and he was her first manager. One of his last things that he did before his recent passing a few years ago was the Ocean 11 movies with George Clooney and Brad Pitt. And a personal favorite of mine, the Mamas and the Papas. Love, 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 love them. Linda Ronstadt, Amy Winehouse, Prince. Just to name a few. So if you are ever in the area, it would be a sin practically not to check these clubs, comedy and rock and roll, out. Most of them can be found on Sunset Boulevard in the Miracle Mile. And now you know why they call that the Miracle Mile. Here's another recommendation. Between recommendation and asides, will we ever get through this article? Yes, we will, my friends. Yes, we will. But here's another recommendation. Drink! And the recommendation is go to Google. Google Sunset Boulevard in 1969, and you will see the street filled with people. And that's how it was for like 3 years, from like 60, 67, 68, 69, and probably even into the early 1970 year. But that's when they started clamping down on, putting signs that said, no shirt, no shoes, no service, stuff like that. The police started coming in droves, and unfortunately, they ended that. It was the coolest thing and the coolest phenomenon in existence, in my opinion, and I would love to have said that I was a part of that. That was a little before my time. I was a hippie. I was 14, and during 1969, I went for a full year without shoes, as did anyone who was anyone. So I am a hippie, and I always will be. But yeah, look that up. I did. Those pictures are phenomenal. There's people, Sonny and Cher used to just hang out there. A lot of people that would also, do the clubs. In those days, rock stars were part of they called it a happening. And they weren't up on some pedestal. They weren't, behind a wall of managers and, management houses to where, and PR people to where you can't even wave at them, without their security people looking at you sideways. You know what I mean? In those days, they were down there on Sunset Boulevard, man, having a joint, or just, talking philosophy and, why we exist with college students and just everybody, So that's another reason why the 60s can't be touched. I'm sorry, but they can't be, because rock and roll, cool as it still is and amazing as it still is, has just gotten a little too corporate. To claim the connection that it should have, quite frankly, with the rock and roll of the late 1960s. There's another 3.5 cents worth. Back to the article. Carrey would sit on the hills above Los Angeles and look over the city. And here's another aside. If you have never done that, oh my God. At night, the view of Los Angeles from the ocean to the skyscrapers, which is quite a spanse, that's the right word, is gorgeous. It looks like diamonds and rubies, sapphires and emeralds have been just thrown out onto black velvet with the starry, starry night of diamonds above. With arms outstretched and millions of fans before him, he recited a paragraph in which he envisioned great success. Quote, basically, I was doing the law of attraction before I ever heard about The Secret. Carrey said, referring to the 2006 book about the idea that experiences are the direct result of one's thoughts. I'm going to stop right here for part 1 of Jim Carrey, Spirituality and Existential Questions. We haven't even gotten to his story yet, and it's quite fantastic. But I can't help but reminiscing about a place that I used to live and still adore severely, which is Hollywood. Could be why I have this YouTube page called Hollywood Stars, Stories, Articles, and More. Could be, never can tell. So we will end this here and come on over to part 2. The story that he tells is fantastic about being in the desert, eating peyote, and his spiritual adventure and awakening, and the specifics of that, and what he saw and what he felt. It is, I am not even scratching the surface of what that story is. So come along. It's on part 2, which is the very next episode. See you there. Soon I intend to be on Patreon. I'm excited about that. Basically, it is a place that helps video makers, among other artists and creators, give you the chance to give them the opportunity to create better content for you. So it is a positive circle, positive love circle. If you are struggling with bills or any sort of monetary thing, please do not contribute. If you are comfortable with that part of your life, I sure would appreciate it. Also, don't forget to give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell if you'd like for information about future shows to come to you directly and immediately. I do this for you, and you go out there and be the star of your own show. Yeah!